So tonight we're going to be talking about the last lesson in this current book. For some of you guys, it's the last lesson. I think it's an important lesson, and it's something you may not think about very often, but it's about you learning and sharing your story. And the idea is that every single one of us have a story. Even though there's a huge generational gap between you guys and me, most of us were probably raised in the same way. And my story may have some similarity to your story, but everybody's got a story, and that's one of the most important things about being a follower of Jesus. And so I want to kind of set it up, and I think you've got some blanks there, and hopefully I'll hit the blanks. If not, we can help you after, fill it out. But when you look through the Bible, the word Christian, like nobody ever got called to be a Christian. It only shows up 3 times. But what Jesus called everybody to be was to be his disciple. And the word disciple shows up over 300 times. And so everything that I hope you guys have learned up to this point, especially those of you that have been able to plug into every single session, is that it's pointing you not to a place where you start claiming a title in your life, but where you actually understand, I'm called to actually do something now. It's not just about gathering information, and I know you guys are at a point in your life where it feels like that's all you're being pushed to do is just gather information, but this information will carry you through the rest of your life. And so that word disciple is just simply somebody who's following in the footsteps of Jesus. And Jesus was known as a teacher, and in his day, when a teacher would come into a town, they would not come just to teach and give information. They were looking for people who could be their disciples, people that they saw potential in, that they could actually believe could not just learn from them, but then go on and do more than that teacher was actually able to do. And so when we're talking about being a disciple of Jesus, it's trying to figure out our own potential, following his footsteps, understanding that we can go on to change the world as well. And so that word disciple is kind of a big deal. And in its very essence, it's just figuring out what did Jesus say do, and then spending the rest of my life figuring out how to go do that. And it's not very complicated. If you read through the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's very obvious what Jesus tells us to do. You cannot go wrong if you'll just set your day that I'm gonna do my best to love every human being I come into contact with. I don't have to agree with them, but I do need to love them. Showing compassion to somebody. You're never gonna go wrong when you show compassion to somebody. Giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, right? Like you'll give yourself the benefit of the doubt pretty quick. I will. But learning to give somebody else the benefit of the doubt. They may not be mad at you. They may not be sideways with you. I mean, you can just go right down the list. That's what it means to be a disciple, is to figure out what Jesus said and then spend the rest of my life trying to do that. The last thing that Jesus says to his disciples is what I want us to focus on tonight. And usually the last thing that somebody says is the most important thing, right? So like when you're sitting through class and you're getting near the end of that class, generally speaking, for the test's sake, the last thing your teacher tells you is the most important thing that he or she wants you to remember. And I think that is certainly true for most of us, and it's true when it comes to Jesus. My wife and I made a decision a long time ago that the last thing we're going to say to each other was, I love you. And that can be taken for granted. You can just assume when you've been married to somebody a long time, well, I know they love me, I don't need to say it. But as the years tick by, we're figuring out it's pretty important. Because if I don't come home tonight, I want to make sure Beth, the last thing she heard was I love her. I still tell my 3 boys that. All of them are now grown. I've got one that's already halfway through college. They're living their own lives. And every time I talk to them, I tell them I love them. They don't always tell me that back, which stinks as a parent. But I want them to know that if, regardless of what goes on in their life, there's at least one person who loves them, and that's their father. And so the last thing that somebody says is often the most important. And I think you've got Matthew 28 there. Is it gonna be on the screen? Yes. Okay, here it is. So it's right at the end of Matthew's biography of the life of Jesus. The last thing he says, here's what Matthew writes. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. So they had kind of a rendezvous point, right? So this is right after the resurrection. Verse 17, when they saw him, they worshiped him. Again, they thought he was dead. Now he's back to life. But some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, which, just as an aside, if you've ever seen somebody get baptized, we always say in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. We're not making it up. It's not a churchy thing to do. It's because that's what Jesus said, go do. And teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very ends of the age. Now, there are two things there I want you guys to see. The very last thing Jesus does is he makes a promise that I'm gonna be with you always. Not on occasion, not when it's convenient for me, but wherever you go, whatever you do, I'm gonna be with you. And if there were one thing that I'd want you guys to hear that actually soaks deep inside of who you are, it is that promise right there. That if you're in a relationship with Jesus, it does not matter what's going on in your life, it does not matter what happens in the life of your family, it does not matter what goes on in the life of the people that you love, Jesus is always with you. There's nothing you can do to make him run away. There's nothing you can say. There's no decision you can make. There's no distance you can run away from him that would cause Jesus not to be with you. He is with you to the end of the age, meaning till you draw your last breath and you see him face to face, Jesus is with you. But then if you back it up, there's a little word in there, and it's the word go. Jesus says, therefore, go. And what that means is that for those of us that are following Jesus, we are a sent people. You can't just take what you experience from Jesus and keep it to yourself. Let me put it this way. That when it comes to faith, there are kind of two components, okay? They're really important. One is there's the private component, and that is your faith. That means you've got to decide what you're gonna do with Jesus. Every single human being does. I came to a point in my life where I finally had to make a decision. Was I gonna follow Jesus? Was I not gonna follow Jesus? Didn't matter what my parents taught me. I'd listened to 1,000 preachers up to that point. I couldn't live off the faith of my grandmother or my girlfriend. I had to make a decision that whether or not I was gonna follow Jesus. So there is that private part of it. You guys have got to decide. That's why we wanna offer you the opportunity in a few weeks to take your next step. That's your decision about what you're gonna do with Jesus. But then there's a public side of our faith, and that's where this word comes in. It's the word go. And in the church world, we made up a word for sharing your story, and it's the word evangelism. And that may be a word that you've heard, maybe it's a word you've never heard. We don't use that word much around here because it's just sort of a weird, goofy word. And when you say the word evangelism, you have to explain what that is. And it's simply just sharing the story of Jesus. So the word evangelism for me, it gives me that image. If you've ever pre-pandemic especially been down around like Market Square, and when there's a lot of people down there, there'll be somebody on the corner and they're holding a Bible and they're preaching, I would argue, screaming at everybody that walks by. Have you seen anybody like that before? When I was growing up, it was everywhere. I grew up in Chattanooga, just down the road. And anytime you went downtown, man, there were people on every corner and they were screaming and wagging their finger and just really getting after it. That's not really the best way to share Jesus. And that, I would argue that's not really evangelism, because most people, I would assume you guys would be included in that, you don't like to be screamed at, right? And it's also, evangelism is not sort of this idea of turn or burn, right? Like telling somebody you're in or you're out or you're going to heaven or you're going to hell. It's not pointing the finger at somebody. It's not passing judgment on them. And it's not trying to make them feel guilty. It is, in the best sense, I think, evangelism. It's just simply figuring out how can I share with somebody that I love the impact that Jesus has had on my life. And so this idea of sharing your story, I want to say right off the bat, it always involves some form of a relationship, okay? You're never going to be asked by anybody in this church to take up your Bible and go stand outside your school and preach to people. This is not the way we operate. It always involves a relationship. So these are people you know, they're people that you care about and love. It's trying to look for that opportunity to tell those people how Jesus has changed your life. And in just a minute, you're gonna have a chance to kind of think about your story, and you're gonna be able to fill out, answer some questions in there. But before you do that, I wanna tell you my story, because I don't get to tell my story very often. As I said in the very beginning, the way I was raised and the way you guys were raised are probably very similar. I grew up in the same kind of family, sort of that middle to upper middle class family. We lived in Chattanooga. It's just 90 miles south of here. Chattanooga's not that much different than Knoxville. I went to a large high school that probably would have been about like a mix between Bearden and Farragut. And it was a huge school. And my family went to church sometimes. We would go like 6 or 8 weeks in a row, and then we'd take 6 months off. And then we might go another 3 or 4 weeks in a row, usually around Christmas. And then we drop out for about 3 months. And I did that my entire life. And it usually it all depended on what sport I was involved in at the time. If it was in between seasons, we'd go to church. If it was in season and we were having to travel, then we didn't go to church. And I heard a lot of guys just like me say a lot of things over the years about Jesus. And there was something about it for most of my life when I was a student that just didn't click. It didn't make sense. It was hard to understand. I tried reading the Bible. I mean, it wasn't a foreign thing in my family. And it was just hard to understand. I grew up in a family that the only Bible you could read was a King James Bible. And if you ever have to read poetry, that's what it's like. It's very hard to understand. Even as a 50-year-old man, it's not my favorite. So it just didn't really make sense to me. And then on top of that, because of the kind of churches we went to, there was a real disconnect in what I heard in the room and how I saw people out in the parking lot. A lot of gossip, a lot of back talk, a lot of people saying things I didn't think from what I heard inside you should be saying. And it just didn't seem like the Christians who went to the church believed what the preacher was saying. And so I just made a decision when I was about y'all's age that I don't want to be a part of it. And so I just went through the motions because my parents made me go to church and I didn't have a choice. And so I just sort of went through the motions until I got in the 9th grade and I met a girl. And she actually was one of my wife's best friends. And she went to this church, and my best friend also went to that church. And over the course of that summer, as I was going into 9th grade, they just wore me out about going to church with them. And finally, frankly, just because I wanted them to shut up, I gave in. And I started going to a youth gathering like you guys are at right now. It's about 150 kids. And back then it was 7 through 12. So you had just gobs of people. Some of the people I knew because they went to my school. A lot of the kids I didn't know. And there were a ton of adults hanging around. And so we started going on every Sunday night. And usually it started after a football game on Friday. They would start in, hey, am I gonna see you Sunday? It would be the same way on Saturday. Usually I would talk to them at some point Sunday afternoon, and then they would meet me at the door when we went into the youth meeting. And I loved it. It was great music, it was great food, a lot of girls hanging around, and it was just a good atmosphere to be a part of. Well, as that one summer started to progress, I became friends with a guy that led the group. This guy like Josh or Manna or Joshua, just a dude. But there was something about him that was different. When all the games were done and after all the food was done and we had a time when he was gonna speak, he was able to talk about Jesus in a way that I could actually understand it. And he made Jesus not a concept or not some guy in a book, but he was able to talk about Jesus in a way that I actually believed maybe this was a real human being and maybe I should start paying attention to what he's saying. And then on top of that, there were some adults around the room and some of my own friends who were further down the road than I was. And, it just wasn't boring. What they were saying made sense. I had a coach who was one of my football coaches, was a person of faith, and he didn't hide it. He didn't make a big deal out of it either. But he was in my life. And over the course of about a year and a half, I was surrounded by enough people who I honestly felt like they loved me for who I was. Like I didn't have to pretend. I wasn't a perfect kid by any stretch of the means, and they accepted me. They didn't pass judgment on how I lived my life. And it felt like every time I went, they honestly wanted me to be there. And if we went on vacation or if I had a baseball game in the summer and I didn't show up, they called me later that night just to make sure everything was okay. It was an incredible experience. And what that did is it kind of opened a door for me. Because up until that point, I didn't really care what Jesus had to say. And I didn't really care about being around Christians. By the end of that summer, I actually started going to church with them on Sunday mornings. And I experienced the exact same thing. Like the adults actually noticed that students were walking in the church. And they actually made us feel like it was okay to be there. And then there was a preacher named Bob Walker. And he got up and he spit and he yelled and he pounded on the pulpit. But he was able to talk about Jesus in a way that I could actually hear what he was saying. And so the point is, when I look back on my life, there were literally dozens and dozens and dozens of people who accepted me, who in their own way talked to me about Jesus. They modeled for me what it looks like to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And then that very next summer, that's the moment it all became real. And Jesus stopped being a concept, and I began to believe that maybe he was real. And as I sat through all of those meetings and went on all those retreats and did all of that stuff, my group was the first group to ever go to Resurrection, if you've ever had a chance to go to that. There were, I think, about 200 of us crammed in a little room with a guy named James Ward, who was a horrible musician, but that started Resurrection. I went to that very first Resurrection. And so I started to realize that if I want my life to go in the direction that I want my life to go in, I had to stop trying to do my life on my own. And I was 15 years old and I already figured out that the pressure that was coming my way as I got older was gonna be too much pressure for me to handle on my own. And so that summer, I gave my life to Jesus. And y'all, everything since that moment that is good in my life is because of Jesus. There's no question about it. The person that I married, there's no shot I would have got her to go out with me on a date if it weren't for Jesus. We've been blessed with 3 boys. One's married, one's about to get married, one's about to finish college. All 3 of them have fallen in love. It's all because of Jesus. The fact that I get to be a part of this church and work with some unbelievable people is because of Jesus. The fact that we even ended up in Knoxville, the fact that I'm a preacher, it's all because of Jesus. And I can trace it right back, not to a specific sermon, but I can trace it back to a group of people who refused to point their finger at me, who never tried to scare me. To my recollection, they never once talked down to me, but every single time, they just loved me. And I am a Christian, and I am a follower of Jesus, and I am a preacher of his gospel because of that group of people. And that's how this stuff works. It's not sharing your story with strangers, it's sharing it with your friends. They were very intentional about living their life around me, very consistent. Who they were on a Sunday night or Sunday morning is who they were on a Friday night or on a Tuesday or on a retreat or everywhere we went. They didn't try to clean themselves up and act perfect. They were just imperfect people who had the love of Jesus, and they wanted to share that love with me. And that's what we're asking you guys to consider. Hopefully, every one of y'all have got a lot of life out in front of you. And there are gonna be a lot of opportunities for you guys to share your story. In the midst of a pandemic, I know life is hard. If you're in school, there's a whole different level of stuff you got to go through. If you're virtual, you're struggling with being by yourself and being disconnected from your friends. But even right now, when you can't live the life that you were living a year ago, there's still a way to share your story. You can do it through social media. You can do it through your posts. It's very, very simple. But what we're asking you guys to do is to continue to learn about Jesus, figure out how to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and then look for the opportunity for you to share your story with one of your own friends. Does that make sense to you guys? So it's not about preaching sermons. Say you got a close friend, they're going through something. Rather than just sort of blowing them off, that's an opportunity for you to just step right in. Maybe it's something as simple as sending them a text saying, hey, I know you're really lonely right now. I just want you to know I'm praying for you. That's it. You know, it's not like, hey, I know you're going through something. What if you died tonight? Would you go to heaven or hell? Not asking you to do that. We're just asking you guys to lean into your friends and let them see Jesus in you. To put it yet one more way, it's learning to live your life so that when your friends look at you, they want what you have. Like if you were to look around your circle of influence, that the people you know and you love, would you want what they have? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. We want you guys, as you grow and live your life, for those of you that choose to go to college or to get married or to have kids or to do whatever you're gonna do, to just remember that you are somebody, that you've given your life to Jesus, and with that comes a responsibility to let others see Jesus in me. Now, in your book, so for some of you guys, the last thing you gotta do, there's 3 or 4 or 5 questions maybe, and Josh can jump in if he needs to, but it basically is to get you thinking about your story, because I understand y'all aren't like me, right, where you've had decades to think about your story. You're hearing about this for the very first time. So this is not about, oh wow, I'm just gonna write out my story and for the rest of my life, this is what I'm gonna tell people. This is just about getting you guys to start thinking about it, okay? And so you're gonna spend a little bit of time in groups. Did they end up sharing? I can't remember. Did they share with each other? No. Yeah. So I'm not calling you up here, so don't freak out about that. But I do want you to just get started. And this is something you're gonna work on literally for the rest of your life if you wanna live the kind of life Jesus wants you to live. There are a lot of people that'll just sort of blow this part off and just hope that somebody like me or one of your leaders does the job for them, but it's not like God's gonna be mad at you if you don't share your story. But what I can tell you is if you end up not sharing your story, you're gonna miss a huge part of what life is all about. It's that deeper connection with the people in your life you love. And there's something about sharing Jesus that makes a huge difference, okay? So take a few minutes with that. Now I think we're gonna pull back together and we'll wrap this whole thing up.
All right, so as we wrap up tonight, we want to thank Stephen DeFur for joining us one more time. Give it up for him. And so remember, this is just kind of this is the starting line. We are just trying to give you guys some language and some tools to identify some times, some places, some moments that have been influential in your faith journey, because this thing's going to continue to evolve. And as I've learned with sitting from some of these 7th grade boys, that maybe we should include a few more not yet type of options, because man, everybody goes at their own pace. Nobody is wrong. We're just so glad that you are going on it, and so glad that we get to join you on this faith journey. So let's pray to get out of here and wrap up confirmation. Dear God, we thank you again for tonight, for these friends, for the opportunity to sit here with you. And God, for these stories, and there is so many different stories just in this room right now that, God, we just say thank you for the people that have helped tell the story of your son, Jesus, for the places that have been special, for where the Spirit has moved. And God, for those moments where you just felt real to us. And God, we just pray for more of those, for more kind words, for more moments, for more just encounters with your son, Jesus. And God, may we be the people that as we share our story, not overcomplicate it, but actually simplify it and just live by the 2 rules of loving God and loving others, because that is exactly what Jesus has been sent here to teach us to do. God, again, we thank you for the opportunity to love these people in this room tonight. In your name I pray, amen.